My Best Friends Live in the Woods. The Adventures of Albert by Anne Michelle Mracek.
Chapter 40. Rescues. Sometimes life brings storms. Water is powerful. It can carve through mountains. It can put out fires. If we have water in our spirit, we will always find a way to flow through or around any obstacle. The lightning flashed and the thunder rolled across the sky and shook the earth. The bucket under the windowsill leak filled and had to be emptied. Then it filled up again when a loud knock came on the front door. Albert opened it to see Mrs. Rabbit, George, and Gabby holding baskets brimming full. They were drenched. Oh, thank goodness, we made it, Mrs. Rabbit exclaimed in great agitation. Mother Skunk ran to them as Bluebell went to fetch towels. What is all this? Mother Skunk asked as they set the loaded baskets in the corner. Everything we could grab, Mrs. Rabbit said and started to cry. Our house flooded, she sobbed. We were throwing everything we own into baskets. I think we got most everything. I made sure to save the purple ribbons. Don't you worry about that, she said as she sat shivering, as much from shock as from being wet. Bluebell handed all three of them a towel and a hot mug of tea. It's raspberry. Go get in front of the fire and warm up, she said, leading them into the hearth room. Larissa came over and put her arm around Gabby. She was crying and holding the towel tight around her shoulders. Oh, Lizza Blue, it was awful, Gabby sobbed. At first, it was just a trickle of water coming in under the door. Mother put a towel down and we thought it would be fine. But the rain kept coming down harder and harder till the towel was floating. We were afraid we might get trapped inside and drowned. Gabby was crying as Larissa held her close. You're safe here, Larissa tried to comfort her. Albert had been listening and went over to the window to see if the rain was letting up. He began to worry as he looked out. Water was coming down in sheets. This is not good, Albert said in a low voice to Benjamin and motioned for him to come and join him at the window. A stream of water was flowing down the hillside and had even pushed some of the sitting logs out of the circle in front. Visibility was low. They could barely see through the sheets of rain. But as they looked, they thought they could see a small group walking toward the cave. Suddenly, Albert called out, "It's the royal family! Open the door!" The sound of the thunder shook the cave as the Great Stag ducked in through the door. Al was sitting on his back. Clarissa had Tidal perched on her back and Anthena close at her side. Go ahead, she nudged Anthena in first. Then she ducked in out of the downpour. Oh, Matilda, thank heavens we made it. Matthew led the way. We could barely see where we were going. There was a flurry of activity. Bluebell was instructing Molly to put on an extra pot of water for tea, and Melody and Abigail were scurrying to gather more towels. Albert pushed the door shut with effort, bracing against the wind. Matilda, thank goodness for you, Matthew said most sincerely. I haven't seen this kind of rain since the flood, and that was years ago. Albert's mind suddenly jumped back to that terrible night. He watched his mother and sister floating away from him. He had lost his home and family and had gotten a new home and family all in one night. He was seeing the raging river the stream had become in his memory. Albert, stop daydreaming and give Owl a hand. Mother Skunk was handing Albert a towel. Poor Owl had his feathers drenched. He was sputtering, oh, well, yes, thank you. Can't fly in this weather, as Albert helped him dry off. Mrs. Rabbit, Gabby, Larissa, and George all stood up and offered their places in front of the fire to the royal family as they made their way into the cave. Poor little Tidal was soaked. Another bright flash and crash of thunder shook the cave. "That was close," Benjamin said, concerned. Suddenly, Abigail yelled, "The beavers! We have to save the beavers!" Her eyes wide in fear. Al sputtered, "Don't be silly. They can swim." "No, I heard Mrs. Beaver yelling for help," Abigail insisted, her eyes darting back and forth between Mother Skunk and Albert. "Please, we have to save them," Abigail pleaded in tears. "You heard her?" Marigold said doubtfully. "Yes, in my mind, and I saw her," Abigail insisted. Albert walked to the front door. "Who is with me?" he said with bold determination. Benjamin was the first to stand up. "I am, brother, always," he said, smiling at Albert. "Me too," Nicholas stepped up. Then Matthew got up slowly, being careful not to tangle his antlers in Mother Skunk's hanging bundles of herbs. "You might need my strength," he said, moving carefully to the door. Al looked at the floor. "I want to go, but I can't fly in this. I'm afraid I would just get in the way." Matthew looked at his friend and saw how sad he looked. "Oh, Al, I can't have you gone. You must stay here and guard Clarissa and Anthena," he said quite convincingly, and Al smiled and stood up at attention. "On guard duty, sire," he hooted proudly. Then Charlie ran up. "Mama, we have to rescue Chitty Witty and his family. I'll go get them," he said, and started toward the door. "Oh, no, you don't." Mother Skunk grabbed him and carried him squirming back toward the hearth. Frank stood up. "He does have a point. They may need help with the triplets. I'll go get them and bring them back here in the basket," he said, walking toward the basket pile. "I'll go with you," George offered. The skunk, George, not the rabbit. At that, Mrs. Rabbit hopped up to Mother Skunk. She was still clinging to the towel wrapped around her shoulders, her nose twitching nervously. "Oh, what about the badgers?" she said, worried. They have triplets too," she reminded. Ricky and Henry stood up. "We're on it." They smiled and patted Mrs. Rabbit's hand. "You know," Albert turned back away from the door, "we need rope." "Yes, of course," Benjamin said, patting Albert on the back. "I have a length in the back room. I was using it to find my way back when I was exploring the cave," he said as he ran toward the back room. He emerged with a long rope circled several times around, hanging off his left shoulder. "Okay then, we're off," Albert said with gusto. "Wait!" Mother Skunk shouted, and they all froze and looked at her. She bowed her head and held her hands up toward heaven. "Great Creator, protect us, one and all. Give us the wisdom and strength to bring our friends safely back to this place." And they all said, "Hear our prayer." "Okay, now we're off," Mother Skunk said and took a deep breath. Bluebell and Mother Skunk stood at the window and watched as they ran out into the downpour. "Oh, please bring them back safely," Bluebell set her arm around Mother's waist. Abigail was pacing, feeling frantic. "They have to hurry," she fretted. Jillian was sitting next to Anthena, smoothingly petting her neck. Her little friend had been quite frightened by the trip from the glen. "You're a priestess," Abigail said, standing in front of Jillian. "Do something." "You chanted magic letters to bring Lissa Blue home," Gabby said, hopping over to comfort Abigail. Jillian looked back and forth between Abigail and Gabby. "I don't know how that happened," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. Out in the storm, Frank and George had locked arms and were bent over to trudge up the hill. The wind and rain were trying to push them back, and the force had turned into slippery mud under their feet. "Hang on, we don't want to get separated," Frank yelled over the pounding rain. "I can't see where I'm going," George shouted back. Normally dry creek beds were now swiftly moving muddy streams. "We better hurry or we won't be able to get back. If this stream gets much bigger, we won't be able to cross back over," Frank shouted as they jumped across the fast-moving water. "Can you see the Boulder Rock?" George said. "I remember their burrow is to the right and up the hill from the Boulder Rock," he shouted, trying to hold his hand over his eyes to shield them from the driving rain. They both stood staring, trying to see a landmark through the sheets of rain. A flash of lightning lit the sky. "Look!" George pointed to the left. "Boulder Rock!" Frank nodded. "I thought it was to our right." They adjusted course and pressed on. "The burrow should be near here." Frank was squinting through the sheets of rain. "Chitty Witty!" he yelled as loud as he could. "Yell with me, George, on 3. 1, 2, 3. Chitty Witty! They screamed as loud as they were able, their eyes searching the rocks. Again, 1, 2, 3. Chitty Witty! "Look there!" George pointed. You could just see a small chipmunk frantically waving his arms over his head. They hurried up the rocks to him. "Help!" Chitty Witty was yelling and pointing to a hollow under a rock overhang. "Get in!" Frank held the basket down and Chitty Witty hopped inside. George got down on his hands and knees and peered into the tiny rock burrow. Mr. and Mrs. Chipmunk were trying to comfort their 3 crying babies. "Charlie sent us to rescue you," George called out as he brought the rim of the basket up to the rock's edge. "Jump in, we'll take you back to Mother Skunk in the cave." "Oh, thank heavens!" Mrs. Chipmunk cried as she scampered into the basket, then turned and reached out to lift each baby in as her husband passed them to her. Then Mr. Chipmunk hopped in. "Where's Chitty Witty?" he yelled up to George. "In Frank's basket," he yelled back, and Mr. Chipmunk nodded and gave the thumbs up. The rain was pelting into the baskets on them, and the 2 parents were trying to lean over the triplets to protect them. "Let's go!" Frank yelled to George. "Stay close!" Going back down the hill was slow and difficult, with only one hand to balance and trying to keep the basket steady with the other. When they got to the bottom of the hill, George looked side to side, confused. "Where are we? I don't recognize this," he yelled. "We must have come down the rocks at another angle," Frank agreed. Hearing this, Chitty Witty scampered up and peered over the edge of the basket. "There!" Chitty Witty was pointing. Frank glanced down, thinking he had heard something. "Go that way?" Frank asked, and Chitty Witty nodded. They turned to the right and kept going, their feet occasionally slipping on the wet rocks. "Boulder Rock!" Frank pointed. "Thanks!" he yelled down to Chitty Witty as they pressed on toward home. Meanwhile, Albert, Benjamin, Nicholas, and Matthew were trudging their way toward the beaver pond. "Seems like we should have been there by now," Benjamin shouted to Albert over the storm. They pressed on and finally came to the stream. Normally, it trickled along merrily with its sloping bank of long grass and fiddle ferns, accented with the bright faces of sunflowers. "Wow!" Nicholas exclaimed as they all stared in disbelief. What was in front of them was an angry torrent of fast-moving muddy debris. Down tree limbs were being swiftly carried along, and the water level was rapidly rising up the bank. They all looked at each other, fear and worry flashing in their eyes. "We better move fast," Albert yelled and picked up the pace as they headed toward the beaver dam. When they got their first glimpse, they could see logs breaking free and being carried downstream. Then they saw Mr. Beaver's head bobbing above the dirty water, a log in his mouth as he tried to repair his crumbling dam. They all waved their arms and shouted out to him. When he saw them, hope sprung up in his heart, and he quickly swam back to his log home and called to the missus. "Help is here!" "Oh, thank you for answered prayers," Mrs. Beaver said, and she hugged her children. What's the plan? Mr. Beaver yelled across this torrent. The four exchanged glances. Albert searched up and down the bank till his eyes rested on a sturdy pine tree. It seemed solid, its roots still above the water level. He pointed to it. "Let's tie the rope there," he shouted to Benjamin. "It's upstream, and the current can take the other end of the rope toward the beavers." They lowered their heads and pressed through the sheets of rain toward the pine. Mr. Beaver called across to them. "The missus and the babies can't swim in this. Current's too fast, and there's none to tow." Matthew stepped forward. "Plan B. Tie the other end of the rope around my shoulders." Albert frowned. "You can't be serious." Nicholas agreed. "Your Majesty, we cannot let you endanger yourself." Matthew was quite serious. "What good am I to the forest folk if I'm not willing to take risks to help them?" he said sternly. "Now tie the rope around my shoulders. If I need help against the current, I'm counting on the three of you to pull me back to the shore." The three of them just stood there and stared, not knowing what to do. "That's an order!" Matthew shouted. "Hurry!" he yelled as another log broke loose from the dam. "Help!" they heard Mrs. Beaver's frightened cry. Albert leapt into action. He and Benjamin wrapped the rope around the stag's mighty shoulders and knotted it 3 times. "Can't have this coming loose," Albert said as he pulled with all his might on the knot. "I'll be back with the beavers," Matthew said as he bravely jumped into the raging waters. "He's coming!" Mr. Beaver yelled to his wife. "Hold on! The Great Stag himself is coming to save us!" The water was cold as his legs kicked toward the beaver's house. He winced in pain as a sharp tree limb banged into him. Albert, Nicholas, and Benjamin watched from the shore as his head and antlers bobbed further and further away from them. Swimming with the current was easier than he had imagined, and shortly he was at the beaver's front porch, or what was left of it. Matthew shouted, "Climb on my back. Each of you hold a baby by the scruff of their necks in your teeth. That way you have both hands free to hold on." Mrs. Beaver was terrified. "Oh my! Oh my!" She started to cry. Her husband kissed her and looked into her eyes. "You can do this. You came back to us from the cloud boat. You are strong. You must save Tulip," he said sternly. Mrs. Beaver took a deep breath, grabbed her baby daughter with her teeth, and jumped into the torrent onto the stag's back. "It's okay, Junior. Daddy's got you," Mr. Beaver said as he too plunged into the water and climbed up onto the back of Matthew's neck. He reached up and grabbed hold of an antler as Matthew let go of the porch and turned upstream. "Swim, swim," he told his legs as he kicked with all his power, but he felt himself losing. The current was dragging him and his precious passengers further away from shore. "Pull!" Albert screamed. The 3 boys braced themselves and pulled the rope toward shore. They made steady progress and could see the stag getting closer. He was still kicking wildly. Nicholas cried out, "I'm exhausted. My arms are cramping." "You have to keep pulling," Albert shouted, but he was beginning to feel a knot of fear in his stomach. Suddenly, the rope began to move quicker, and they could see the stag making real progress toward them. Albert glanced over his shoulder to see Mr. Badger and Henry pulling the rope behind them. His heart smiled as new hope surged in him, lending renewed strength to his own efforts. Soon the Great Stag stumbled to get a foothold onto the shore. "Hold on till we are all the way up the bank," he yelled at his passengers. Soon they were all hungry and yelling, "3 cheers for the Great Stag!" Even the relentless sheets of rain couldn't dampen their spirits. Suddenly, they heard a great crack, and they spun around to see Mr. Beaver's dam burst into a mass of moving logs. The torrent smashed into their lodge, and it broke apart with a deafening explosion of breaking wood. No! Mrs. Beaver screamed, seeing her home burst into pieces and carried downstream with the torrent. She began to sob. "It's gonna be all right. I'll build it again. It's what I do," Mr. Beaver consoled her, patting her hand. "Praise the great Creator for sending our friends to save us. We would have been swept away with that," he said, looking at his rescuers with true love and gratitude in his eyes. As they trudged back toward Mother Skunk in the cave, Albert asked Mr. Badger, "How did you know we needed help?" Mr. Badger smiled. "Jillian came running up to our den just as Henry and Ricky showed up. She sent us to you and went back with Ricky to escort Mrs. Badger and the triplets back to the cave." Albert and Benjamin looked at each other with a mix of confusion and worry. Hadn't they left Jillian in the cave to console Anthena? "Well, thank goodness she sent you. We wouldn't have had the strength to pull them out without the two of you helping," Benjamin said, nodding his approval. Back in the cave, Bluebell was still standing at the kitchen window. She couldn't force herself away and stood praying non-stop as she strained to look for signs of their return. Ricky, Mrs. Badger, and her triplets were already most of the way back home. Ricky was confused. Just as he had caught sight of the cave, Jillian had vanished. "She must have run on ahead," he said to Mrs. Badger. They exchanged worried looks. Charlie and Chitty Witty were playing by the fireplace, and the rest of the Chipmunk family were snuggled in a dry towel munching on brown bread. Frank and George were thankful and excited to be back home. "We got a little lost," George was telling Mother Skunk, but Chitty Witty pointed the way. "Well, I'm just thrilled you brought them back safely." Mother Skunk smiled, proud of her boys. Bluebell called out, "Someone's coming!" she said, as she could make out hazy figures moving their way. Praying it was Benjamin, she opened the door and called out, "Hurry in!" she yelled. Mrs. Badger's voice called back, "Coming!" Then a drenched Ricky and Mrs. Badger and her triplets ran in the front door. "Did Jillian make it back?" Ricky asked Mother Skunk anxiously. Mother Skunk pointed to Jillian, sitting by the fire with Anthena leaning against her. Ricky and Mrs. Badger looked at each other confused. "She sure dried off fast," Ricky said to Mrs. Badger, pointing at Jillian. Bluebell resumed her post at the window. Tight knots were forming at her stomach as the seconds ticked on. Then she yelled, "They're here!" and everyone ran toward the front door. Bluebell threw open the door, a blast of wind catching her apron. Then Benjamin bolted in the door, picked her up, and twirled her in a circle. He kissed her and then shouted, "We did it! They are all safe!" Just as Albert and Nicholas ran in, followed by Henry and Mr. Badger. The Great Stag knelt as Mr. Beaver with Junior and Mrs. Beaver with Tulip slid off his back and gratefully stepped into the safety and warmth of the dry cave. Everyone cheered. "We couldn't have done it if Jillian hadn't sent Mr. Badger and Henry to help," Albert was telling everyone as they retold their adventure. "But, Albert, Jillian never left the cave." Mother Skunk pointed to Jillian, still sitting by the fire, comforting Anthena.
Chapter 40. Rescues. Discussion and questions. Bravery and safety. Being brave is a state of the spirit. It is not an absence of fear, but of doing what is right. It is the ability to act in the present and work through the fear. The greatest motivation for bravery is our love for another. When we truly love someone, we are capable of extraordinary acts of bravery to save them. Question 1. Have you ever needed to be brave to help someone else? Question 2. Has someone ever bravely saved you? The entire forest community knows Mother Skunk's cave is a safe haven, and everyone gathers there. Question 3. Have you created a home that is a safe haven? Question 4. Is it important to open your home to family and friends in a time of crisis?
I am the composer and performer for all the music in this video. Both audio recordings and the printed scores are available on mybestfriendsliveinthe.woods.com. I will provide the link below. The painted illustrations are also my creation. Prints are available on mybestfriendsliveinthe.woods.com. This is a novel. The chapters are meant to be heard in the order in which they were written. And while each chapter can stand alone, they do build as new characters are introduced and past events are referred to. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. The chapters are numbered, so if you're just joining us, be sure to go back and watch from chapter 1.
In a dream, in a trance, my spirit flies to the pink horizon of the forest, where fairies say, "Come and play," and the animals say, "There's a better way," an enchanted land of love.